Welcome to The Faithful Citizen. I'm Ellison Keller. Today, we explore the breathtaking irony of the WWJD movement, how the evangelical industrial complex tried to tame a socialist radical question, and why the generation that wore the bracelets eventually had to leave the church to find the God who is already waiting for them at the margins. Let's get into it.
Yeah. Welcome to the space where conviction meets rhythm, where truth got a mic and the church gotta listen. This ain't Sunday talk, it's real life living. Faith in motion, the citizen's mission. We talk grace, we talk justice, we talk peace. Not the kind that conforms, but the kind that frees the world's loud with noise. We cut through the vision, this is the faithful citizen. Let's get to the wisdom.
If you look deep enough into the back of your childhood dresser drawer, or uncover that plastic storage bin tucked away in the darkest corner of your closet, you'll probably find one. It's likely sitting alongside a well-worn guitar pick, a silver True Love Waits purity ring, or a faded t-shirt from a church lock-in you haven't thought about in 20 years. It's a simple strip of woven nylon, usually in a bold primary color fastened with a cheap black plastic clasp. Sewn into the fabric are 4 letters, WWJD. What would Jesus do? For those of us raised in the evangelical youth group culture of the 1990s and early 2000s, this wasn't just a piece of merchandise. It was a cultural uniform. It was the ultimate, inescapable moral compass for an entire generation. We wore them until the nylon frayed and snapped. We wore them until they smelled like sweat, stale pizza, and summer camp lake water. We were told by earnest youth pastors in graphic tees that whenever we faced a decision, a temptation, or a crisis, all we had to do was look down at our wrists. The bracelet would remind us exactly how to live. The adults in the room, the pastors, the parents, and the executive elders thought they were handing us a simple behavioral management tool. To them, the bracelet was just a handy way to keep us, teenagers, in line. But there was a disastrous mistake in their merchandising plan. They didn't understand that the 4 letters woven into that cheap nylon formed the most dangerous, radical, empire-shattering question in human history. They handed millions of sincere kids a piece of live ordnance and told us it was a toy. The great heartbreaking tragedy of the modern American church isn't that our generation eventually removed the bracelets. It's that we actually kept them on. We grew up. We learned to read the Gospels without the institutional filter. We took the mandate seriously, and when we finally looked up from our Bibles and stared at the capital-driven, exclusionary fortresses that raised us, we experienced a profound and shattering cognitive dissonance. We realized that the radical, downwardly mobile Jesus we were reading about was nowhere to be found in the sanctuary. He certainly wasn't sitting in the executive boardroom. The institution handed us a woven mandate to ask, what would Jesus do? But in doing so, they accidentally forced an entire generation to ask a far more terrifying question. To grasp the true, breathtaking irony of the WWJD movement, we need to examine the origins of the letters. The phrase wasn't created in the 1990s by a Christian marketing company seeking to exploit youth group trends. It was actually born a century earlier in 1896, in the pages of Charles Sheldon's hugely popular novel, In His Steps. Sheldon was a Christian socialist, and his novel served as a key text for the social gospel movement. In the story, a local pastor challenges his comfortable middle-class congregation to pledge for a whole year to do nothing without first asking, what would Jesus do? The outcomes in the novel don't include a sudden rise in private piety. Instead, they lead to economic and social upheaval. Characters give up their saved-up wealth, overthrow corrupt business practices, restructure their companies to share profits with workers, and physically move into the slums to care for the urban poor. For Sheldon, the question was a blunt, unapologetic demand for systemic justice. It was a direct challenge to the hoarding of wealth and the exploitation of workers. It was a plea for radical, risky, downward mobility. A century later, the modern evangelical movement drained Sheldon's question of its deep disruption, turning it into an empty shell that generated profit. In one of the most remarkable theological bait and switches in recent history, the evangelical industrial complex took a broad critique of capitalism and transformed it into the most lucrative Christian merchandise campaign of the 20th century. Millions of dollars were earned by mass-producing a command originally intended to motivate people to give away all their money. But the domestication of the question wasn't just economic, it was deeply behavioral. By the time the four letters reached the wrists of 1990s youth group kids, the question had been fully stripped of its socioeconomic sharpness. The empire reduced the cross to the size of a permission slip. We were taught that WWJD was mainly a guide for personal, private piety. What would Jesus do? To a teenager in the late 90s, the answer was obvious. Jesus would listen to DC talk instead of Nirvana. He wouldn't swear. He would confidently debate his high school biology teacher about evolution. He would sign a True Love Waits pledge card and stay a virgin until his wedding night. And he would vote for the conservative political candidate. We were given a cosmic, world-changing question and told that the answer was simply to be a compliant, polite, and thoroughly respectable middle-class kid. The gospel was localized to the high school cafeteria and our bedroom. This domestication wasn't an accident. It was a matter of sheer institutional survival. The genius of the evangelical machine was realizing that if they could successfully redefine WWJD to mean nothing more than private behavioral morality, the question would never threaten the empire itself. If sin is only about what we did in the backseat of a car, or what explicit lyrics were in our Sony Walkman, then the massive grinding gears of institutional greed, systemic racism, and unchecked patriarchy go entirely unexamined. The gatekeepers kept us constantly terrified of our own hormones, our own doubts, and the secular culture outside the walls, precisely so we would never look at the architecture of the church itself. They needed us to keep looking at our wrists so we wouldn't look at the ledger. Because if a youth group is busy policing its own media consumption to ensure it's being good Christians, it'll never consider asking why the church's multi-million-dollar building fund looks nothing like the Sermon on the Mount. They'll never question why the male-only elder board functions like a Fortune 500 company. And they'll never wonder why the institution ruthlessly protects its power while claiming to follow a God who voluntarily surrendered his. The domesticated bracelet didn't just shape our behavior, it served as a vivid, colorful smokescreen. It effectively concealed the fact that the radical, table-flipping Jesus of Nazareth was completely missing from the institution. But the empire made a disastrous mistake. They forgot that teenagers eventually grow up. They forgot that someday we would open the book and read the blueprints ourselves. The greatest miscalculation of the modern religious empire was assuming we wouldn't actually read the book they gave us. They handed us the WWJD bracelets and told us to anchor our lives in the Bible. And the profound tragedy for the institution is that we believed them. We were an earnest generation. We went to the Friday night lock-ins, wept at the altar calls, highlighted our Bibles in 5 different colors, and desperately wanted to live faithfully. But as we grew out of our teenage years, went to college, and entered the real world, something dangerous began to happen. We started reading the text without the institutional filter in place. We stopped reading the Gospels as a scattered collection of memory verses designed to keep us abstinent and polite, and we started reading them as a cohesive historical narrative. We laid the unfiltered blueprints of the faith out on the table, and the shock was earth-shattering. When we actually asked the question, what did Jesus do? The historical record was clear, and it was utterly devastating to the evangelical status quo. We discovered that the Jesus in the text looked absolutely nothing like the executive sitting on the elder board. We read about an itinerant homeless rabbi from a marginalized ethnic group living under brutal military occupation. He didn't build a fortress. He didn't launch a capital campaign. Instead, he was actively, aggressively, downwardly mobile. He systematically bypassed the religious elite, the wealthy, and the politically connected to center the very people the empire had cast aside. When we looked for the Jesus of our youth group, the respectable, conservative, rule-following patriot, we couldn't find him. Instead, we found a Jesus who touched the untouchables and healed the unclean, breaking strict religious purity laws to do so. We found a Jesus who elevated women to the highest levels of spiritual authority in a patriarchal culture that legally considered them property. His longest recorded theological conversation was with a Samaritan woman at a well. He chose women to be the very first commissioned preachers of the resurrection, entrusting the foundational message of the Christian faith to voices the religious establishment deemed entirely unqualified. We found a Jesus whose harshest, most blistering condemnations were never aimed at the secular culture, the sinners, or the marginalized. His absolute holy fury was reserved exclusively for the religious gatekeepers, the men who used theology to hoard power and crush the vulnerable. We read about a Jesus who didn't politely debate the temple authorities. He wove a whip of cords, flipped the tables of the money changers, and executed a prophetic strike against a religious machine that was exploiting the poor for profit. The jarring contrast between the text and our reality began to tear us apart. We looked down at our bracelets, then up at the modern American church. We looked at the multi-million-dollar sanctuaries equipped with concert lighting and fog machines, while the neighborhoods just outside the parking lot struggled with poverty and eviction. We looked at the male-only executive boards operating like Fortune 500 companies, systematically silencing and sidelining women. We looked at the political rallies disguised as worship services, where pastors proudly aligned themselves with the exact kind of wealthy, exclusionary empires that crucified our Savior. We realized that the bracelet wasn't a call to polite moral conformity. It was a mandate for absolute rebellion against the religious establishment. We realized that if the historical Jesus of Nazareth walked into one of our megachurches on a Sunday morning, he wouldn't be invited to preach. He would be escorted off the premises by the volunteer security team. This was the breaking point. It wasn't a crisis of faith in God. It was a crisis of institutional cognitive dissonance. We were told to ask, what would Jesus do? But the moment we realized what he actually did, a terrifying new whisper began to echo in the back of our minds. We sat in the sanctuary. We listened to the perfectly rehearsed worship bands. We watched the pastors deliver their culturally sanitized, comfortable theology. And the whisper grew louder. He isn't here. The institution had given us the question, but the answer was nowhere to be found inside the walls. The sanctuary suddenly felt hollow. The empire felt like a tomb, and the generation that had been trained to seek the footsteps of Christ found themselves looking around the empty, heavily guarded fortress, asking a new, devastating question. Where did Jesus go? The most dangerous thing you can do with a domesticated theology is take it outside. As we grew older, we refused to leave the bracelet in the confines of the high school cafeteria. We took the question out of the youth room and carried it into the real world. We carried it into voting booths, city council meetings, corporate offices, and neighborhood associations. We took the mandate seriously and started asking, what would Jesus do about the massive, load-bearing pillars of American society? We started asking what Jesus would do about systemic racism and police brutality. We asked what Jesus would do about the LGBTQ+ community who were being systematically crushed and driven to suicide by the very institutions claiming to love them. We asked what Jesus would do about the unhoused families sleeping under the overpasses just 3 blocks away from our multi-million-dollar worship centers. We asked what Jesus would do about the hoarding of capital, the crushing weight of medical debt, and a political system that treats the vulnerable as entirely disposable. And as we started asking the question, a profound theological awakening took place. We finally found the answer to the terrifying question that had been haunting us in the pews. Where did Jesus go? We realized he hadn't disappeared. He had left the building. If the Jesus of the Gospels was entirely absent from the executive boardroom, the VIP green rooms, and the political rallies of the religious right, it was because he was out in the streets. We looked outside the heavily guarded walls of the fortress and saw him standing with the excluded, the poor, the vilified, and the broken. We found him at the margins, actively working to dismantle the exact kind of supremacist empires our churches were trying to build. So we did exactly what our youth pastors and Sunday school teachers had trained us to do. We followed him. We joined the protests. We demanded affordable housing. We set up mutual aid networks. We openly advocated for our otherized friends and family members. We stood up in church business meetings and asked why we were spending millions on LED screens and fog machines, while the local public schools couldn't afford basic supplies. We advocated for the exact things the Jesus of the Gospels explicitly commanded: equity, mercy, wealth redistribution, and the tearing down of corrupt, predatory religious systems. We brought this realization back to the gatekeepers, expecting them to be thrilled. We thought we were ushering in a revival. We thought the elders and the pastors would look at us with tears in their eyes and say, "Yes, you finally get it. This is exactly what we've been trying to teach you." Instead, we got a disciplinary hearing. The moment we applied the bracelet to the empire's systemic rot, the gatekeepers panicked. The illusion had been shattered. They suddenly realized that they had successfully raised a generation of believers who loved the Jesus of the Bible more than the survival of the institution. And to a religious machine built on the hoarding of capital and power, nothing is more terrifying than a congregation that actually wants to act like Christ. What followed was one of the most vicious, coordinated theological gaslighting campaigns in modern history. The empire couldn't explicitly say, "Stop acting like Jesus, it's hurting our bottom line." So they had to change the vocabulary. They took the exact biblical behaviors of Christ: feeding the poor, seeking racial equity, challenging religious nationalism, and demanding justice for the marginalized. And they rebranded them as secular threats. Overnight, the pastors who gave us the bracelets started weaponizing cable news buzzwords against us. If we advocated for racial justice, we weren't following Jesus. We were infected by critical race theory. If we demanded that the church care for the poor instead of building another stadium, we weren't reading the Sermon on the Mount. We were pushing a Marxist agenda. If we fought for the inclusion and safety of marginalized communities, we weren't practicing biblical hospitality. We had compromised with wokeness and bowed to the culture. The church had taught us to ask the question, but they made the actual biblical answer a fireable offense. They needed WWJD to remain a harmless behavioral checklist, keeping teenagers polite and abstinent. The moment the question grew teeth, the moment it threatened their budgets, their political alliances, and their exclusive grip on power, they abandoned the question entirely and went to war with the very kids they had raised. We had finally found where Jesus went. We found him in the dirt, at the margins, calling out to the vulnerable. But as we stepped out of the sanctuary to join him, we heard the heavy wooden doors of the church locking behind us. There's a very specific, agonizing genre of grief reserved for the generation that took the youth group mandate seriously. It's the trauma of being exiled by your own spiritual parents. The deepest betrayal wasn't simply that the institution had lost its way. It was that the very pastors, elders, and mentors who strapped those woven bracelets to our wrist were the exact same people who called us heretics the moment we actually lived out the mandate. When you spend your formative years being taught that following Jesus is the ultimate goal of human existence, you naturally assume your religious community will celebrate when you finally start doing so. You assume that advocating for the poor, demanding equity, and standing against corrupt power will be met with a glad embrace. Instead, we were met with excommunication. The modern religious machine has spent the last decade spinning frantic defensive narratives about the Great Deconstruction. They write endless articles, host conferences, and preach breathless sermons trying to explain why the pews are suddenly bleeding millennials and Gen Z. And their favorite, most comforting lie is that we left because we simply wanted to sin. They tell their remaining congregations that we were lazy, that we were seduced by secular culture, or that we simply didn't want to submit to biblical authority. It's a deeply convenient fiction. It allows the gatekeepers to completely absolve themselves of any responsibility. If we left because we are rebellious and sinful, then the institution doesn't have to look at its own rod. But it's a lie. We didn't leave the church because we wanted to sin. We didn't leave because we stopped believing in Jesus. We left because of Jesus. We walked out the doors because the cognitive dissonance became a matter of spiritual life and death. We left because the institution ultimately required us to betray the very gospel they had taught us to read. They asked us to pledge our loyalty to political strongmen, to cover up institutional abuse, to turn a blind eye to systemic racism, and to tithe to a multi-million-dollar fortress while the neighborhood starved. They told us to look down at our wrists and ask, what would Jesus do? And because we knew exactly what he would do, we knew we could no longer stay inside the building. We asked, where did Jesus go? And the answer led us straight to the exit. But stepping out of the empire came with a staggering, devastating cost. When you leave the modern American megachurch, you don't just lose a Sunday morning routine. You lose your entire social safety net. You lose your community, your lifelong friendships, and in far too many cases, your own family. The conditional nature of evangelical love is never more apparent than in the moment you step out of line. The moment you prioritize the radical, downwardly mobile Jesus over the preservation of the institution, you become an enemy of the state. We learned, in the most painful way possible, that the community we were raised in was entirely conditional. The condition was never actually faith in Christ. The condition was absolute loyalty to the empire. What Jesus did cost him his life. He was executed by an alliance of political and religious gatekeepers who found his radical equality far too dangerous to tolerate. We shouldn't have been surprised that following in his actual steps cost us our spiritual homes. We thought the bracelet was a piece of youth group jewelry. We thought it was a behavioral checklist. We didn't realize until it was too late that it was actually a map. And if you followed that map honestly, it didn't lead you to the executive boardroom or to the center of cultural power. It led you right out of the fortress, past the heavily guarded doors, and directly into the wilderness. If you still have that faded, frayed piece of nylon sitting in the bottom of a drawer somewhere, don't throw it away. We shouldn't regret the bracelet. We should just regret that the people who gave it to us didn't understand the explosive ordnance they were handing to a generation of earnest kids. Today, the modern religious empire is in absolute panic. Pastors are writing frantic books, hosting emergency conferences, and publishing endless think pieces trying to solve the great mystery of the mass exodus. They look at the empty pews where the millennials and Gen Z used to sit, and they blame secularism. They blame college professors. They blame social media, progressive culture, and a lack of biblical submission. They're entirely blind to the terrifying, inescapable truth. Their youth group programming worked too well. The institution didn't lose us to the secular world. They lost us to the Gospels. We didn't walk away because we stopped caring about Jesus. We walked away because we became exactly what they accidentally trained us to be. We became radicals who actually follow Christ. We took the mandate seriously, and the moment we did, the machine excommunicated us for it. To the deconstructors, the ex-evangelicals, and the weary exiles who are reading this, hear me clearly. You're not crazy. You're not a heretic. And you're not spiritually lost. You're just wearing the bracelet. You had the courage to look at the religious empire that raised you, look down at your wrist, and ask the hardest question of your life. What would Jesus do? And when that question inevitably broke your heart, when it forced you to look at the massive multi-million-dollar fortress and ask, where did Jesus go? You didn't settle for the comfortable lie. You didn't stay in the boardroom. You followed him to the margins. Leaving the modern American megachurch isn't an act of spiritual rebellion. It's an act of profound, holy survival. It's the necessary exodus required to keep your faith intact. You can't follow a foot-washing, downwardly mobile God while sitting inside a heavily guarded fortress built to protect the hoarding of wealth and power. The machine is going to stay inside their walls. They'll lock the doors, circle the wagons, and continue to aggressively defend their budgets, their political alliances, and their exclusive grip on authority. They'll keep asking why the sanctuary feels so empty, completely unaware that the God they claim to worship has already left the building. Let them have their crumbling fortress. Out here in the wilderness, we're still asking the question. We're still demanding equity, pooling our resources, fiercely protecting the vulnerable, and doing the quiet, unglamorous work of building a fundamentally different kind of community. We don't have a massive budget, a stadium, or an executive board. But out here in the dirt, a wide, flat table is finally being set, and Jesus is already sitting at it. Thank you for spending this time with us. If this episode challenged you or offered a bit of clarity while you're navigating your own way out of the fortress, the best way to help us grow is to hit that subscribe button, like the episode, and leave us a rating. It may sound small, but in the world of algorithms, those actions go a long way toward helping this message reach the people who need to hear it most, especially those still looking down at their wrists and wondering where the God they were promised has gone. We want to keep this conversation going. Head over to the Substack to read the full transcript, engage with the community in the comments, and share your own reflections on what it means to stay faithful and what it means to finally follow Jesus to the margins. Finally, for those who have asked how to support our work here at The Faithful Citizen, I've included a link in the show notes to a new paid subscription tier. I want to be very clear. This is completely voluntary. We're deeply committed to keeping all of our essays and podcasts freely accessible to everyone, regardless of their ability to pay. Your support simply helps us sustain the research and production that goes into every episode and helps us keep this table wide and open. Until next time, keep asking the hard questions, keep looking for the table in the dirt, and stay faithful to the path wherever it leads.